Well, good morning, friends. Welcome here. If you're new with us, my name is Paul, and I have the honor of being the lead pastor here. And we are in the midst of a series called the Torah. Now, if you were with us from the beginning, you would know, or you maybe have heard, but I'll remind you again, that our theme for the whole year is the story of God. And so as we travel and journey through the story, we want to start at the beginning and look at the Torah. Now, the last couple of Sundays, we have said that Torah means instruction and law, but it's also used as a name for the first 5 books in the Bible. And so later we began to call it Pentateuch, which is 5 tukes, 5 scrolls, 5 books in the Bible. So the last 2 Sundays, we unpacked Genesis. And if you missed it, you can catch up to all the conversations, or if you're new with us today and you're like, hey, what are you guys talking about, this Torah thing? And I'm kind of maybe curious about it. Our messages are posted on our YouTube channel, so you can check it out and catch up that way. But really, as we looked at Genesis for 2 weeks, we took this really high 10,000 up in the air view of Genesis, because you can't do Genesis any justice in 2 Sundays. So we took a really high view of Genesis, beginning of the Torah, and we looked at themes and threads that were setting the story for us. We looked at the big themes that we found in this first book in the Bible. Now today, we're going to continue that high version, this high view of the book as we enter the next book in the Torah. And as we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to look actually at the setting of the story. Before we even jump into the book, we're going to look at what setting do we need to notice that the Bible authors wanted us to know. Because settings tell a story. Right? In every story you've ever heard, there's a place where the setting is where the action happens. For example, I'm going to show you a few pictures on the screen, one at a time, and then I'm going to invite you just to yell out, what story does that setting tell you when you see this picture? So just like one thing or a sentence, like what story does this setting tell you? Oh, sorry, anybody? Olympics, I heard Olympics, okay. Maybe, who else? I didn't hear it. I'm a little deaf. I ask for people to yell out and then I can never hear you, so my apologies. But maybe love story, romance often is connected to Paris. Maybe a holiday, a holiday we want to take. The setting, this Eiffel Tower, often brings this ideas of some kind of story when we see it. Okay, how about this? What story does this next setting tell us? Hockey, okay, yeah, sure. What else? Canucks, yes, good. That's the right answer. We get it. That's the perfect answer. They're going to win the cup this year, right? Excited about this? Yeah. Somebody laughed. Come on. Lots of Oiler fans here. All right, good enough. National pastime, right? We see this image and it connects us to Canada, to pastime, to hockey, to all those kind of things, rivalries. It tells a story. How about this next image? Farms, right? Home, I heard, right? Hard work, yes. Yeah. What's that? Bounty, okay, yeah. Yeah, it tells a story. Images, settings, they tell us a story. How about this one? What story does this tell? Work, I heard work, yeah. Maybe grief, maybe hope. What's that? COVID-19, okay, yeah. There's a lot of stories that this setting tells us, right? And for some of us, it's a joyful story. For others, it's maybe a harder story. Okay, how about this one? I don't know what you said, but people laughed. Oh, fake. Yeah, it definitely tells the story of conspiracy theories, for sure. Maybe space race, Cold War, science, for sure. It does tell a story. MTV for some people. It does tell a story. This image does tell a story. This setting tells a story. Okay, a couple more. How about this one? National treasure, is that what I heard? Conversations, so-so coffee, is that what I heard? It's a great place. It's a great place. It tells a story. People in the States, when we were visiting once, were so excited they were getting Tim Hortons, so it's good. All right, how about this setting? What does this tell us? Archaeology, good, yeah. What else?
Heavy.
Sorry?
Heavy.
Heavy, okay, yeah, yes. Yeah. Maybe Prince of Egypt or whatever. Yeah, it tells a story. All of these images, all of these settings cue for us an important expectations that we have come to learn, to grow, and to know. When we come to see a movie, whatever setting it begins with, whatever music is even played in the setting, cues for us what kind of movie this will be. Will it be a romantic comedy? Will it be a scary story? Will it be action-filled? All of these settings cue for us a story. Settings matter to our expectations. And friends, the Bible is no different. Today, as we continue our study of the Torah, of these first 5 books of the Bible, we enter the most famous and central book in the Bible. Now, it's not central because it's in the center. It's actually the second book. It's Exodus. But it's central to the whole story of the Bible, and I hope we can catch that theme today. Now, what comes to your mind when you hear the book Exodus? What comes to your mind? Maybe a mysterious talking burning bush? Or a baby boy in a basket floating down the Nile River by himself? Some maybe have pictures of Charlton Heston, his version of Moses. Or maybe you are thinking of Prince of Egypt, the cartoon, right? There's a variety of things that Exodus cues for us, especially if you grew up in the church or if you're a Bible reader. Now, in the Bible, Egypt is for sure a place, a country, a nation. And for the biblical authors as well, it is so much more than just a nation, a country, and a place. And just as we jump into this story, I do want to be clear, when we're talking about Egypt in the Bible, we're not specifically talking about the modern day Egypt and the people there and the government there. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a biblical story that's represented in time and space of Egypt that does represent a country, but it actually represents a lot more than that. All right, so I just want to have you that in mind as we're talking. So Egypt in the Bible is a central place and a setting for where the foundational theological, that is, God themes, God stuff shows up in a big way. And everything that kind of shows up in Exodus begins to be actually repeated through the entire scriptures. The themes that we find in Exodus are repeated over and over and over. So the setting of Egypt is where we learn God's name. I am that I am. We learn how God acts. We see the rhythms of his actions, and we see how God's character and how he acts is continued through the Bible. So Egypt actually becomes a significant setting in the story of God. Egypt is something that's referred to throughout the Bible. And again, it's not referred to just because it was a nation and a place in a set time. There's much more going on here. So let's find out what's going on. Let's look at the first 7 verses of the book of Exodus, chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. In time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Now, for some of you, if you're a Bible reader or if you've seen Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments movie, you're kind of familiar with this passage. You kind of know what's going on. And because we're familiar with it, it kind of starts with the genealogy a little bit, and you're like, okay, get me to the action of Exodus. Because of that, we can kind of gloss over it. But what's happening in these first 7 verses? Why does this scroll, this book, this Tukh, why does it begin this way? Well, the first thing we want to notice here is the reason it's beginning with these names is that Exodus is meant to reflect the continuation story of Genesis. They're connecting the lineage here. They're trying to make sure we don't miss that this is a continuation of the story. Now, Kurt last week did a great job of teaching us how Abram was called out. Abram and Sarai were called out to a promised land, and God changed their name to Abraham and Sarah. And they were meant to be these representatives of God in this world. And so now Exodus, what it's doing for us is actually cueing to us that this is the continuation of that family, of that story. That's why it starts with Jacob, or as he was renamed, Israel. So Exodus continues 400 years later from Genesis, but it is a continuation. Okay, so that's the first thing the biblical authors want us to catch. The second thing they want us to catch is actually found in verse 7. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Now, do you see the setting happening in this verse 7? The Bible is brilliantly pointing to something for us to notice. Now, we as modern readers can really miss it because we just don't necessarily think in repetitions in the same way. We don't think of settings in the same way. But this verse 7 is not a throwaway statement about the healthy libido of Israelites. It's actually a really significant verse connecting the readers to a setting. It's trying to remind the readers that as this story continues, this is a continuation of the setting we experience in Eden. Right at the start of Exodus, the Bible wants the readers, wants us to hear an opposition to God's voice through Pharaoh's voice. The voice that defines for itself what is good and evil. Pharaoh sees how much fruitfulness and multiplication is happening in Israel community, which drives him to feel threatened and angry. The Bible is declaring to us the opposition to God's purposes, who himself told humanity to be fruitful and multiply. Exodus is specifically echoing Genesis 1:28. It starts by echoing the start of the story. The command from God declaring for us the beauty and flourishing that was meant to be experienced by all people who are meant to live freely, alive, and part of creating new life. Eden, space and place with God. Exodus, on the other hand, starts with this opposition. It's echoing this by an opposition to the blessing from God. It begins the continuation of the story by echoing how it's opposing the order that God intended. Pharaoh feels threatened by this fruitful multiplication, and his response to God's blessing is slavery and death. Pharaoh would rather have people die than be free in the way God intended it. So our starting point in this journey of Exodus shows us that the setting of Egypt, that it is ruled by Pharaoh, a representative of gods of Egypt, who act in opposition to God of the Bible. This is how the story begins. Egypt, the superpower of its day, ruled in opposition to God's idea of blessing, a ruler who responds to the threat of growing number of people in his country by forcing them into slavery. Pharaoh has them work every day without taking a break, making bricks, building storehouses for himself. And many of us are kind of familiar with that part of the story, right? These are the things that when we read or when we watch the show or the movie, they represent all the slavery and the whipping. And that's true. But what the author wants us to catch here is that the setting, Egypt, is a setting that's working against the purposes of God. And this is shown particularly in the fact that Egypt is an empire built on the backs of slaves. Creation was all about sending us to be co-creators with God, partners in relationship with God, being co-creators with the creator of the whole universe. Egypt is the opposite of that. Built on slaves. And this is so significant to the story of God, friends. We can write books on just this one verse. So much so that I want to suggest when Egypt is mentioned in the Bible from now on, it represents this anti-Eden. A place where the anti-purposes of God exist. A place where it's anti-God's kingdom, anti-God's creation, anti-God's practices and rhythms. Egypt represents anti-Eden. It's anti that which God intended. That where human definition of good and evil is in opposition to God's definition of good and evil. And the biblical authors are brilliant here. They don't want us to miss this. They want us to track with the setting and the story, being reminded how far we have come away from God's purposes. That even though Exodus is a continuation story, it's continuing Genesis, but by book 2, we are so far removed from God's purposes that we're enslaving and killing children. Egypt, then, for the authors of the Bible, becomes the most significant setting in the scriptures. It is central setting in that it represents oppression, death, and suffering. If God's purposes and flourishing and presence is in Eden, if the garden, if that's a representation of being with God, the Pharaoh and his empire represents everything that's against that, anti-Eden. So notice the pattern. Let's go back for a moment to Genesis again. Now, if we just jump back to the story of Abraham that Kurt introduced to us last week, Abraham, God calls Abram out. He says, go to this place, go to this promised land, go from your country. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to do all these things. And it's an amazing story. And then in Genesis 12, right in the middle of Genesis, when famine hits, now I don't know if you remember this story, but this is right in Genesis. When famine hits, in the book of Genesis, Abraham goes where? To Egypt. Instead of staying put and trusting God, he goes to Egypt. This is already, the setting is already being cued for us in the previous book. And what happens when he goes to Egypt? Well, we learn he goes really badly. In Egypt, Abraham lies about his wife. She's beautiful, and he thinks he's going to get murdered if they think she's married to him. So he says, she's my relative, his cousin, sister. And he lies about her. And because he lies, the Pharaoh pursues her. And he's trying to marry her, and there's this whole mess that happens. But then God rescues the whole mess by striking Egypt, in Genesis, with plagues. Egypt, plagues? Wait, isn't that Exodus story? Yes. But it's also a setting introduced already for us in Genesis. A pivotal metaphor for Egypt. Brilliantly introduced for us as a setting, in a narrative which represents a place of trouble, but also a place where God steps in to rescue. And this pattern and setting continues to repeat for Abraham to his descendants, to eventually, just as we read in the first 7 verses, to the nation of Israel, showing us how far we have moved away from God's purposes and design. Egypt, where fruitfulness and multiplication, where this blessing is met with evil, death, and slavery. And so once again, God brings plagues and rescues his people, setting a pattern, cueing us to notice that Egypt becomes the place where bad choices lead to chaos, but also where God steps in to rescue and to redeem. So much so that when later characters in the Bible go to Egypt, like when Solomon goes to Egypt, it's actually cueing for us to pay attention that something might not go well for him. But I'm getting way ahead of myself by getting to Solomon now. But Egypt becomes a place where bad choices lead to chaos, but also where God steps in to rescue and to redeem. All right, let's dive deeper into what we know about Egypt from Exodus. At this point, Pharaoh, who rules Egypt, is at this point the most sinister figure we have encountered so far. His kingdom is embodiment of humanity's rebellion against God. And Pharaoh isn't just evil. He's redefining good and evil every day to serve his own interests, to the point where murder of innocent children becomes, in his eyes, a rational solution. And the people cry out. And they cry out for help against this new form of evil. And God responds by turning Pharaoh's evil plot and turning it upside down. And we learn in the story that the Israelite mother puts her boy into a Nile in the basket, and a child flows right into the Pharaoh's family, and the boy's named Moses. And he eventually grows up to become a man God will use to defeat Pharaoh. And notice the repeating motifs again. As humanity's choices to define good and evil for themselves create more and more chaos, we find in the story that God is not distant, that God is not aloof, that God is not indifferent. We have seen it through the entire Genesis account, and now we see it in Exodus, this continuation that God always hears the cries of the oppressed. And we need to pause on this massive statement. God always hears the cries of the oppressed. As you look around your life, as you look around your world, your setting, that God's story does not want you to miss this. God always hears the cries of the oppressed. This reminder is trumpeted throughout the entire story of God as a reminder of God's character. God always hears the cries of the oppressed. God continually steps into anti-Edens to rescue, to redeem, to restore, and to renew. This is exactly the story Jesus is part of. God's character is who he is. It is centered on this reality that he hears and he enters into the suffering and pain of our lives. Friends, this is so important. This is all from the first 7 verses of the story. The reason we are navigating and even exploring Torah isn't to sound smart, that we know a word for the first 5 books of the Bible. We're doing this because if we want to follow Jesus, we need to understand the story he believes he's part of. And we learn in the story of God that Jesus locates himself in the Exodus story. And then he invites us to do the same. In this Exodus story, because God has heard the cry of the people, God has come to do something about their oppression. God chooses Moses to be his representative, a representative of his people. And Moses and Pharaoh, they go back and forth insisting on freedom, and Pharaoh, reasserting slavery. Moses demanding liberation, Pharaoh enforcing bondage. And plagues and disruption of this evil empire is brewing through Moses and Aaron and people who join in with God's purposes to rescue. And finally, Pharaoh relents. And it's time to leave Egypt. It's time to leave anti-Eden. But before they do, there's instructions for leaving. Maybe you know this part of the story. Very specific instructions on what to do on this night of rescue. And those instructions center around a lamb. On the night of the Exodus, every Jewish man was instructed to take a lamb for his family, one for each household, to sacrifice it, to eat the meat roasted over the fire, with your cloak tucked into the belt and your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. A lamb that is slain, a lamb that is innocent, a lamb sacrificed for each family, each household. And so as the climax of the plagues approaches, the Pharaoh's end finally draws near. Instead of letting Israel flee wildly into the desert, God tells them to stop. Sacrifice a lamb, cover the doorposts with its blood, and share a ritual meal. The lamb is to be a substitute for the firstborn of each Jewish household. Whatever divine retribution is about to fall upon Egypt on anti-Eden will pass over the households, sparing the firstborn where the blood of the lamb appears. And for us modern readers, this can be very confusing, and let's be honest, a little bit disturbing. It doesn't, we're just so far removed that it does have some disturbing feel to it. Like, what? Blood of the lamb sacrificing on our doors? Why this particular ritual? And why the emphasis on the firstborn? But we need to be reminded that the culture of the time, we can't impose our culture on the culture of the time. The culture of the time, the firstborn son served as a representative of the whole family and took care of all the matters of the family. Therefore, if the lamb redeemed the firstborn, then the whole household would be saved. For the Egyptians, the firstborn son of Pharaoh had the same rank as Pharaoh himself. He was the son of the god Ra, of their gods, and would thus carry on the rule after his father died. This meant that the dynasty depended on survival of the son more than the father. And in this ancient period when life and death seemingly were at the whims of fate, the firstborn son was a form of national security. So Pharaoh and his people, the firstborn son, was a sign of God's raw, ongoing presence with them. It was a sign of anti-Eden, empire of tyranny and evil. But the God of Israel also had a son, didn't he? Look what I am that I am tells Moses to say to Pharaoh. He says, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son. I commanded you, let my son go so he can worship me. Israel is God's firstborn. And through this group of people, God's intention is to show the world what God is like. That God wants to redeem all humanity through the firstborn son. God's judgment then on the firstborn of Egypt is a declaration that the gods behind Pharaoh's brutal and oppressive rule are powerless and will no longer be allowed to tyrannize humanity. Pharaoh's being judged. Plagues have brought the world's superpower to its knees. But before the journey can begin, there's got to be a meal. A Passover meal commanded to the people to never forget it. The people are told to set aside a date and make it the beginning of their calendar. Because this time will now be marked by this event. It's that significant to God. We'll read in the scriptures and say, when your children ask you, then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord who passed over the house of Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down an empire. A lamb sacrifice for the people becomes the flashpoint for God's renewal. Blood on the doorposts of the house of Israel. And this becomes the central point of the story, doesn't it? So much so that later on in the story, when the people of God find themselves again as exiles in Babylon, people make connections to this situation of slavery in Egypt. And this is so important. The prophets later on, then they paint even a bigger and a wider picture of what the new Exodus would look like. They realized that all of creation was in this sort of exile. And for all creation to leave exile and to come home, it would take more than the blood of an innocent lamb. Sin would have to be dealt with in a very new way. And so the prophets described a suffering servant, a firstborn child among God's firstborn nation, who would take upon himself the burden not only of Israel's exile, but of the exile of the whole humanity. The prophet Isaiah said that the firstborn son of Israel would emerge and he would be despised and rejected. A man of suffering and familiar with pain. Suffering he would endure would be such that people would hide their faces from him. He would take the pain and suffering of others upon himself. He would not look like the powerful rulers of the empires. No, he wouldn't look like them at all, but would be considered punished, stricken, and afflicted. Prophet Isaiah promised that someday the suffering and exiled Israel would produce a suffering servant who would not be spared. The sacrificial lamb would be a man, a firstborn son, and he would take the path not of violence and coercion of the empires, but of sacrifice. If I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of. Because God hears the cries of the oppressed. And when he does, ultimately, Jesus is his response. From the opening paragraphs to the closing line, a life and death conflict that intensifies throughout Exodus becomes a story about human evil overwhelmed and changed by divine blessing. The blood of the Lamb is about something far bigger. Jesus is the representative of the entire human family. His blood covering the entire created order. Jesus is renewing all things. Jesus is leading all of creation out of Egypt of violence, sin, and death. All that was lost in the garden, all that is anti-Eden, all that is exile is being redeemed in the act of the firstborn son. Egypt is a setting where anti-Eden is being destroyed so that people, all of us, can return to Eden. So that all of us could return to the garden that God had intended for us, to be in his presence. It's a setting reminding us how far removed we are from God. But God does not stay aloof or indifferent. He enters to save and to hear the cries of the oppressed. Now, as the band joins me on stage, as we conclude and respond today to what we heard, I want to just reaffirm that settings matter. Egypt is a place and a space, but it represents so much more. And the biblical authors don't want us to miss in ways that we can become so drawn away from God's purposes. So much so that we can even justify and rationalize something that is evil because it's working for us. Settings matter. They tell a story. They tell a story. What story does this setting tell? Our setting has a history. It has a present, and it has a future. What story will we tell when we hear of God's character, that God hears the cries of the oppressed? How will we respond? Anti-Eden results in death and graves. God's response isn't to be aloof, but to step into that anti-Eden, to step into that Egypt and to rescue. And then he invites his people to join him in the renewal of all things. Friends, he turns graves into gardens. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you that you hear the cries of the oppressed. We thank you that you do not become distant or aloof. We thank you that you turn graves into gardens. Amen.